Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. So let's talk about math and the Big Bang Theory. And just to be clear, we're focusing in on the show, not the concept, although the concept does have math, of course, but we're going to focus on the show. We're going to talk about how there's math in universe, of course, and how that's used. Which it gets brought up often, so we'll talk about that. But also math in the more meta sense regarding the show, and math just how it's used in general, because I will never tire of that. But as we go, I'm going to talk about my feelings with the about the show, which are complicated, um, or rather, I should say they're complex. Like, right, because I feel like they're pretty clear in terms of what they are. So they're not complicated in that sense, but they're complex in the sense that, like, I have a nuanced approach to it. Um, but I not only want to talk about my feelings towards the show, but also people and the internet. That should be interesting. Um, so we're gonna talk about all these things and more, and just to be safe, assume that will be spoilers ahead. I don't want to hold back, um, in so many ways. Okay, so again, spoilers ahead. Let's get started. So with the Big Bang, I'm sure a lot of you all already know about that show, but it lasted for 12 seasons, nearly 300 episodes, um, and over that time, there's been a lot of conversation about that, but we'll get to that. As far as math and how it's used, like just if we focus in universe, honestly, how math is largely used in reality. There's math in the academic sense, and that comes up a lot in the show, right? That idea that hey, we're looking at the universe and we're saying things about it, and that academic side is the problem solving side of it. It's the language side of it, um, and I think that's cool because that's how it is in reality, um, and or just yeah, and when they're talking about that, they end up, of course, talking about the universe as a whole, and then there's varying opinions on that, but that's how it is in real life too. You have academic math, you have universal math. Universal math is everywhere, it's everything, it is everything, and the academic math is there for us to make sense of it. Now, there are things in the show where someone will conclude something about someone's ability based on how they're dealing with academic math, which is unfortunately something that happens in reality too. But much like in reality, that is nonsense. Math is something that we do naturally, beautifully, wonderfully. But I do like how we do see some parallels to reality, some good, some bad, right? So with the show, we're primarily concerned with science, engineering, and like math comes up so much regularly, and they do have consultants for that throughout the show's career. So always glad to see that sort of thing, and I like that. But math comes up in other ways, just like it does in reality, right? Because there's math in cooking, there's math in music, math in gaming, math in comics, just math across the board. And like there's so many conversations that they have regarding gaming and comics, things along those lines, where they're bringing up math and comparing characters, power levels, power scaling, that sort of thing. And so a lot of that stuff comes up, and I think that's cool, and I think that's interesting. Now, what I will say too is like, while a lot of these things I think are cool, there are ways where they poke fun of that, and I don't always like that, but I do understand that it's the joke. But I don't always like that. With that in mind, speaking of jokes, right? Comedy, whether people find it funny or not, some people do, some people don't, is something that's inherently mathematic, and the Big Bang is focused on it. Um, Now, with that comedy, it's like there's the setup plus the punchline, and that equals the joke. That's the basic formula, right? For the joke. And that can get played around with, right? Because this can be done um, through the traditional, like vocally spoken joke, but it could also be like a running joke. It could be a physical joke. You can be subversive with it. There's a lot of possibilities. Timing is important. The environment's important. How well we know the characters, that can be important. Or if you're just tuning in, keeping it general enough to be funny. Now, the style of humor is something that is debatable amongst a lot of people. And we're going to save that too. But my whole big thing is that comedy is something that's inherently mathematical, and Big Bang is no exception to that. Like they have their ways that they set up their jokes. But there's not only math in that comedy, but like of course how it's presented. There's math in how the characters are acting their parts, how that comes across to you, how they're using their voice, their positions in regards to each other, but just themselves. There's math in each episode, how long that's going to be, how much you're going to stuff into that episode, how long the seasons are going to be, and um, just how long the show is going to run, right? And there's so many factors that contribute to that, right? Money is a thing, ratings are a thing, and I think the interesting thing about like Big Bang is, right, like you can find information about contracts and contract negotiations, and that's all part of it. You don't always hear that much about acting because it's like, yes, doing the job is one thing, getting paid is another, but it's just like you could also negotiate what you're getting paid if you're in a position to. In the case of Big Bang, like regardless of how you feel about the show, right, it was pretty popular, and I'd argue it still is. And so at the time where it's running, you had actors who were able to negotiate their contracts and get more money, right, like per episode, and of course overall as a result. And there's just math and all of that, right? And I think that's cool. And again, like given the focus of the show, math is front and center because how could it not be, right? They talk about science and engineering all the time, but while we're here, math again is everywhere. Like science, engineering, sure, but also art, um, and also with games, like because the characters play a lot of games, whether we're talking about video games or like tabletop games, they play a lot. And math plays a factor in all those too. Like for instance, like if they're playing D&D or some similar game, or if they're playing a card game, they have rules and regulations and how that all plays out. And like with D&D, like you have stats, you have how everything's working in that game, how it functions, how it flows, and that's all cool. And with video games, they play many different types, and you know there's math in how video games are in general, how they function, how they flow, the rules of the gameplay, all of that. Um, and so, and again, like, there's just so much more you can talk about because, right, they're all big fans of like comics, and comics are something that are inherently mathematical. And you have them not only debating the comics, but they're buying them, they're discussing their worth. And the same with a lot of other things in the show. They'll talk about their worth and how much this is worth or that's worth, or hey, this is a collectible. Let's talk about how rare this is. There's so much more that you can talk about, right? So yeah, there's a lot of math in Big Bang. A lot of it on the surface, a lot of it that isn't, because we don't always talk about how math is being used. But I can keep on going and going and going with it, but I do want to pivot to how I feel about the show and then talking about how some other people feel, and just kind of comparing notes before I wrap it up. So, with the Big Bang, I have complicated feelings about it, or like I said it earlier, complex. Because I'm very, or at least it's very clear to me how I feel, but it's just like I have mixed feelings. So that's where the complexity lies. Because, okay, so here's the thing, right? There are some jokes in Big Bang where the thing is like, okay, I'm not a fan of the word nerd, but like that gets thrown around a lot in reference to the show in universe and out. And so, there's the idea of quote unquote nerd culture, and God, I fucking hate that term. I said what I said. Because it's just like we like what we like, and at a certain point, it's like, is it nerd culture if things are mainstream? I'm just saying, right? We pick and we choose these things, and like there are some people who like, they don't mind the term nerd, and they've switched it, right? Like what it means to them, and that's fine, that's fair. I'm just not a big fan of that word, and with Big Bang, how that term is used, because it's like on one hand the show is like it kind of markets itself as something that's like celebrating again the quote unquote nerd culture, um which things like gaming and comics and stuff come up, but again those are just things that people like at this point, right? um but anyway, like they have the characters, and they're supposed to be celebrated for their interests on one hand, but they're mocked on the other hand. And I think my thing is there's so many things in that show that maybe a lot of people on that mainstream level, at least when it came out, may not have been exposed to, and maybe they were either interested after watching it, or maybe someone was interested and they felt a little bit more comfortable by talking about it, or because of how popular Big Bang is, maybe some things got talked about more overall that weren't getting talked about. So on one hand, I like the idea that hey, they're bringing up things that don't always get brought up in shows. And again, I like the map art. I like that they actually had consultants, but at the same time, I don't like a lot of the jokes because of the nature. But um, but that's my thing on it, right? Uh, but here's my thing, right? Like with the show, I'm not gonna say that it's unfunny because there are some parts that are actually really funny. I just think the humor is better when it's about the characters and their shortcomings rather than their interest or rather than some references. So I think like it is funny at points, or I could watch an episode and it has some really hysterical moments, but then it has some moments where I'm like, ugh, right? Um, so it's confusing for me, but it's like it's a show that like I've been able to watch with my family over the years, and maybe there were things in there that like I was interested in and they didn't either know about or get at the time, and like maybe they learned more about watching they maybe learned a little bit more about it watching that show with me and like having conversations with me, my brother, stuff like that. um saying, hey, is this a thing that's happening, right? So on one hand, I like it because it's a show that I can watch with my family, and like we can laugh at certain parts and just like talk about others. And I do like watching the journey of the characters through that, like even if they are like all horrible people. um so that's my feelings on the show. It's like there are parts of it that are hysterical, parts of it that are actually really well done, but I don't like when people are mocked for their interests. I don't like that part, but that's also a big part of the show. So that's my complex feelings on it. Like, because I say complex and not complicated, or I try to make that distinction because if it was complicated, maybe I wouldn't know how I felt, or maybe it'd be more difficult for me to explain. But here, I know what the problem is. Now, I think the internet is where it gets interesting, right? Because I think for a lot of people, if they're watching along, they're probably not bothered, right? Because they're just like, oh yeah, that's funny. Um, but for some other people, they don't like the show because they're making fun of interests that they have, right? Where on that same level, there's some people who actually like they don't care, or at least they're willing to deal with it because they're like, hey, well, at least they're talking about it, right? And that's interesting. Now, what I've also seen though is some people who like they get super offended and they say some of the weirdest, craziest things about that show. But it's like I get where some people are coming from an extent, but it's just like I'm not gonna sit there and say that I think the show is unfunny because again, like I found parts of it funny, enough to watch it, enough to watch it with my family and talk about it with my friends. And I remember when it came out, it was just fascinating because there wasn't like that I recall a show on that level, like in that public eye like that. Um, and a lot of conversation was generated back then. Now, I was not absolutely sold on the idea. There are parts of it in the beginning that I like and don't like, but I like I think after that first season or so, or maybe a few seasons, they got to branch out a little bit more, and I did like that a bit more because some of the earlier seasons are harder for me to watch. But yeah, so it's 12 seasons, and I think it's hard to say that that whole show would be considered unfunny. Um, but it's like we all do have different sides and styles for humor that we prefer. There's a better way to say that, but my point is, right, like it's a divisive show. It can be polarizing at times. So it's like if you like it, I get it. If you don't, I still kind of get it. I'm somewhere in the middle because there are parts of it that I like and parts of it that I don't. But I have been rewatching some episodes like when I visit family, and it's interesting to see because it's like, oh, I like parts of this, but I didn't like that. So hopefully that makes sense and you have a better understanding of how I feel about the show. But I did want to cover it because it's very math heavy in an outward way, and also I wanted to talk about my feelings about it. So I'll see you in the future. Professor Prime out.